This evening, I want to talk about some metaphors that I think can be helpful in kind of informing us and in helping us gather our attention and our priorities and our aspirations in this practice of mindfulness, of the Dharma in the broadest sense, the practice of waking up to the truth, waking up to who we truly are. And I want to explore just a little bit the metaphors of being on a journey, spiritual journey, the metaphor of a spiritual path. What does it mean to be on a spiritual path if we identify with that or with those metaphors? And also to look at a very kind of important archetype within Buddhist teachings and Buddhist tradition, which is a kind of an expression of the path, the expression of an open, awakened heart. And that's the archetype of the Bodhisattva. That's a kind of traditionally a being who's kind of done the work to wake up themselves, but stays in the realm of birth and death until all beings are awakened. So it's really a kind of an archetype of intention, of aspiration, of compassion, that I think is a particularly important one in the time that we're living in right now. I feel very strongly myself that this is a time in our history that really calls on us to make our practice really alive in the world. And there are many, many different expressions of how that might manifest. But very much this practice is not just about kind of our inner work, which is obviously crucial and central, but that it naturally flows out into engagement and compassion towards the suffering of the world, to help relieve the suffering of the world. And I want to begin with a poem that is probably familiar to many of you, but I think it really speaks to a shift that we can take in our lives that's can be quite a profound and important one. And the poem is Mary Oliver's The Journey. She says, "One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to shine through the sheets of cloud, and there was a new voice that you recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save." And for me, that poem really captures that kind of the shift that we can make in our lives when we see that the old ways of doing things aren't serving us, and that we hear, it's an inner voice that kind of takes us in a new direction. I want to explore that a little bit this evening. But I want to really begin just by asking, what are you doing here tonight? What are you doing what are we doing when we come to a class like this or another activity like this to meditate, maybe listen to a talk, engage in a particular spiritual practice, mindfulness meditation, insight meditation, or you do it in your own life, the practice in your own life. For the vast majority of us here, I think this wasn't the practice of our birth and our upbringing. It was something that we came to, probably most of us in our adult years. But it's something that, perhaps even if we're here for the first time tonight or the second or, not very early in our engagement with these teachings and practices, there's something that speaks to us. There's something that says to us, this is important to me. I'm going to take time out of my day, out of my week to do this. To, as with the poem I shared earlier in the meditation from Martha Postlethwaite, to create a clearing in the dense forest of our lives, to kind of create that space and to explore, what's calling for my attention, what's calling for my open-hearted awareness, what's calling to be let go of, that maybe isn't helping me, isn't serving me. So what is it that we're trying to achieve or to let go of or to cultivate? I think it's helpful to ask that question, to step back from the specific practices that we may do regularly or more intermittently, to reflect on what our intentions and aspirations are, and also how our practice is unfolding, and is it leading us to where we're wishing to go. So to kind of, it can be helpful, I think, to step back in this way. I think for most of us, there's a combination of two things that bring us to this practice. And really, I think, to any authentic spiritual practice. And the first is kind of like the way what Mary Oliver expresses in that poem, The Journey. We realize that the old way of doing things, maybe our old ways of living, isn't working for us, or isn't working as well as we hoped it would. That we're not perhaps happy or fulfilled, or that doing things in the way we have been is not providing us the happiness that we seek. That sense of one day you finally knew what you had to do. Things not really working for us. And maybe the other side of the coin is the second is the sense of a hope or an inkling that there's a greater happiness, peace or freedom in another direction, another way of living, another way of being. And so we embark on a journey. So I think in some way, for most of us, when we embark on a spiritual, a journey, a spiritual path, there's some sense of maybe of things not working or not being fully satisfactory. In Buddhist language, the word is dukkha. Dukkha, normally translated as suffering, maybe best translated as a sense of unsatisfactoriness. So for some, the former, the kind of the sense of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness, can be most strong. It can be particularly if somebody, feels there's nowhere else to go. For example, when someone reaches rock bottom and realizes they need to make a radical change in their life. For others, life may be going along okay, but there's a sense of there being something more. And then embarking on a journey to find greater peace or greater freedom. And if we look at these impulses, to embark on a new direction in our life, wherever it may have happened. And maybe it's not, to some of it's not, to some of us it may not be all that clear, that there is a sense of being on a journey or on a specific spiritual path. But I think it's worth reflecting on. This impulse, perhaps, to embark on a new direction in our life is really expressed very much in the central teachings of the Buddha about suffering and the end of suffering, of, feeling that things aren't going perhaps the way that we want them to go. Life isn't giving us the happiness or the joy or the freedom or the peace that we're looking for. Or just that sense that there's more. We can think of the Buddha's journey. Probably for most of us there'd be some familiarity with the story of the Buddha's life, of him, being a prince or a son of a noble family and having really everything he could possibly want, all the comforts and luxuries of life, and palace for each season of the year, and all of the things anybody could possibly look for in material terms, but having a sense that there's something missing, that there's more to life than this, that even with palaces and servants and luxuries and comforts, it doesn't stop sickness, aging, and death. It doesn't stop the sense of unsatisfactoriness. And so there was a yearning. I mean, it's an extraordinarily powerful story of that sense of seriousness and dedication, because Siddhartha, as he was, left the palace, cut off his hair, became a wandering ascetic, and just embarked on a journey full of uncertainty, full of not knowing where this would lead, but with this sense of this a kind of a spiritual urgency, I think might be a way of putting it. To find if there is an end to suffering. And as we know, through his efforts and through going down some paths that were more dead ends, or maybe they're paths that there was learning from, but they didn't provide the ultimate answer, that he sat under the tree in what is today Bodh Gaya in northern India, said, I'm going to sit until I see clearly. And then, in that full moon night of May, some 2,500 years ago, saw into the truth about suffering and the end of suffering, and that there is an end to suffering. And then embarked on 45 years of teaching to help others, find that freedom that he had himself awakened to, that is the birthright of all of us, of all beings. That we all have this, sometimes called the Buddha nature, this kind of that longing for freedom within us, even though it may be obscured, and may be, hard to access, that this freedom is available to us. And that's what he taught, and that's what all his teachings really point to. So just if you think of your own life, was there a time that your spiritual journey or a spiritual journey became clear to you? Maybe for some there is a point though you could say, okay, this is when it happened. I realized that things weren't working for me, or I realized that I really needed to kind of really pay attention to this area of my life. And if it's something that you haven't given thought to, I think it can be a very powerful metaphor for kind of a sense of touching into our deepest intentions and our aspirations. I think it's important to reflect on, because if we don't, there's a line attributed to Yogi Berra who said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. If you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. So, yeah, if we don't know where we're going, if we don't have a sense of that intention, that aspiration, we will end up someplace else. It probably won't be where we're wanting to go. If we don't know what we want, what our intentions are, our life will tend not to move in the direction of greater happiness, of freedom, of peace, but will tend to be maybe an unexamined life, a more habitual life, maybe one where there's, a degree of comfort and familiarity, but something missing that, that might otherwise have been possible. I'll share a little bit about my own kind of journey. Not in any sense, not as special, but it was interesting to me, and it has really informed my practice for many years and some decades now. If I had to kind of put a date on it, I could do so. It was 30 years ago, and if I had a calendar for 1986, I could probably find the exact date. And it wasn't, not to say that what went on before was not relevant, but there was a particular turn in my life that happened at that time. And I share the story just because, it might be of some interest, just as one story of how, of how our journeys begin, and probably every one of us has a unique story. For me, I was living on the West Coast, and I was very involved in activism around Central America throughout the 1980s. And, I was in very much a kind of that organizing mode where, changing the world and, everything depended on, how much energy and effort you put into doing things and organizing things and demonstrations and calling Congress and all of those things. And I wasn't interested in contemplation or religion at all. I tended to think of religion as the opiate of the people. If I thought of Buddhism, it would have been just as kind of navel gazing, But I was visiting the home of my partner's family in Salt Lake City, and I just picked up a book. It might be a book that's familiar to some of you. It was by Alan Watts. It was called The Way of Zen. And I just started reading this book. Zen was a little bit more sexy than Buddhism generally. It came out, the countercult, the 60s, had a little bit of a cachet. And it was somewhat esoteric. It talked about Kensho and Satori and things that, I didn't know, well, what exactly those things mean. But it was also intriguing, and it had an effect on me. And I was out one evening, and I wasn't familiar with where I was, but I was wanting to get back to where I was staying. And my mind was in this really tight place, and it seemed like crucial to know, is it this way or is it this way? And it was like trying to solve a crossword puzzle or something, brainstorming. It was like, or in Zen, there's the koan, where you try and solve what's the sound of one hand clapping? You keep working. It felt like that. And there's suddenly just something let go. There was a letting go that happened. And with it came a real sense of a deep release and really a huge laugh. It was as though, I'd been missing the joke. I hadn't got the joke, and suddenly, it was like, and the voice came to me, an inner voice or from somewhere. It said, "Just walk, just walk." And with that, just walk was a kind of like a deep letting go. That, and for some months after that, I just lived in a kind of much more spacious place, a much freer place. Probably many of us here, maybe on retreat or in other ways, have had those experiences of some letting go, and there's a sense of ease, of freedom that comes, that we're not so kind of knotted up in a ball. it was an unusual sense of freedom and ease, and it was linked to the book that I was reading, but obviously not just a product of reading a book. It wasn't like I read the book, but it was like the book had somehow triggered something in me, and so it was clear to me that this was a direction I needed to follow, and the externals of my life remained much the same. But something had turned within me that began a period of searching. So that was kind of where my journey, or this part of my life's journey, this spiritual journey, really happened. I could see this as the beginning of this spiritual journey. And it was interesting, again, many of you probably had the experience of coming to meditation either to a class or doing it on your own and kind of saying to yourself, like, what am I supposed to be doing? And am I doing it right? Anyone ever asked themselves that? That sense of, what, am I there yet? Am I doing it right? And stuff. And so for the next few years, I kind of bumbled around. I didn't know where... it was a sense of exploration. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't have a clear sense of direction. I didn't have a practice. I just had a sense that I needed to follow the breadcrumbs, as it were. Read more Buddhism, read more Eastern literature, more mystical poetry, and then it would lead me in the direction that I needed to go in. And I didn't even realize that meditation was a big deal in Buddhism. It only gradually came to me. But I began to practice sporadically, with those questions. Am I doing it right? Where am I going? What's the purpose of this? But a shift came when I did a long retreat. Longish, a week, 7-8 days retreat up in Massachusetts at Barre. And, if any of you have been on retreat, many of you have, I know, after sitting in silence and with some degree of discomfort and pain for about 6 or 7 days, I realized how much I loved the stillness and the silence and how it touched something deep in me. And I knew that in some essential way I'd come home. I think probably others have felt that, and particularly on retreat where, if you think of, our practice and somewhat as being like, where our life is like, water in a jug with mud in, it's all shaken up, and often we can't see through it because we're so, things are so kind of so shaken up. But if we just let it settle, then the mud settles down to the bottom and the water becomes clear. And going on retreat can be like that. Just coming into the stillness and settling. Often not easy, but a tremendously fruitful practice. So when I sat my first and second and then other retreats, what I experienced was the journey turned into a path. The journey became actually a path. It shifted from being a more general kind of exploration, trying to find the way, to a realization that this was the path that I wanted to follow. That there was, it was something more clearly delineated than a journey. I think of a journey as kind of setting off and kind of going in a general direction. But a path, the nature of a path is that it's been walked by others before us. Even though we have to find our own way through our own efforts, through our own diligence and our sincerity and commitment and courage. It's a journey with a defined sense of direction. The path goes, the Buddha's path from suffering to liberation. The path of mindfulness is taught by the Buddha as the direct path to liberation. Just taking any aspect of our experience, any part of our experience, and just paying attention in an open-hearted way to this, tension in the belly, or a strong emotion, or our breath, or many, many other parts of our experience, just to let that be kind of the place we we bring mindfulness to. And then that in turn leads to clear seeing. That's why this is called insight meditation. It leads to a seeing into impermanence, that everything changes. It's seeing into selflessness, that, all of these are kind of changing energies coming and going, that is there a solid and permanent self attached to any of it, in the body or in the emotions or in the thoughts or in any other part of our experience? And can any of it be held on to? Is any of it reliable? So when we gain those insights into impermanence, it leads to letting go, and it leads to freedom. So it's a journey with a direction and an end, normally with challenges and obstacles, and practices and skills to work with the challenges that arise. And a path calls for our commitment. It calls for us to make effort, to make courageous effort, to kind of move along the path towards the end of the path. The end of the Buddha's path is freedom from suffering. So just to say a few words about the Buddha's teachings and the Buddha's path. The core of the teachings is that true happiness, peace, and freedom come from our relationship to our experience, from how we meet the present moment. When we meet the present moment with acceptance, with kindness, with an open heart, we can find freedom in the midst of even the most difficult circumstances, amidst life's 10,000 joys and 10,000 sorrows. So simply bringing kind attention with acceptance to what is arising moment to moment is the doorway the Buddha taught to freedom from suffering. And when we meet our experience with resistance, we suffer. In the Buddha's teachings, the second of the refuges, what we can find that is actually reliable in this life. The first is taking refuge in the Buddha, in that capacity that we all have to wake up. The second is taking refuge in the Dharma, taking refuge in the truth, in reality. Taking refuge in the Dharma is finding our place to stand, our support in reality, in truth, in the way things are. The third, as you may no doubt know, is taking refuge in community or in the Sangha. So taking refuge in the Dharma is radical acceptance, deep-rooted acceptance of ourselves and our life as it is here and now. Things may be dire, they may be difficult, there may be much that we feel needs to change, but we start from and open to the truth of where we are. One elder, one teacher, a wonderful elder in the Theravadan tradition, Ajahn Sumedho, puts it like this. He says, it's like this. It's like this. This moment is like this. Can we meet this moment? It's like this. Sadness is like this. Craving is like this. Pain is like this. Joy is like this. And we bring the same open-hearted awareness to our world. How many of us have found the times we're living in, the electoral period and the period since then, particularly challenging. Anybody? No. I'm sure many of us over recent months have thought, I don't believe this, that, and how many of you have found this practice, these teachings and practices, to be of help in working with all that's coming up, in seeing and experiencing vulnerable communities under attack and individuals, and beloved rights and freedoms being threatened. The Buddha said, nothing should be clung to as I or mine. When we cling, we suffer. When we let go of and end clinging, we end suffering. Opening consciously and open-heartedly to life as it is the gateway to freedom, as well as the ground for wise action in the world. There's another metaphor that I like a lot, that comes, that a friend of ours, a teacher on the West Coast, Philip Moffat, uses as the title of his book. And the metaphor is dancing with life. Dancing with life. Philip Moffat's book is Dancing with Life, Buddhist teachings, Buddhist insights for finding meaning and joy in the face of suffering. And I think this, for me, this metaphor of dancing with life is a really powerful metaphor for skillful practice. To dance with life is to open fluidly to the challenges and difficulties of life, to the joys and the disappointments. To dance with life is not passivity or resignation, but to be fully engaged with life, to love life. But to truly love life, we have to accept how it is. Otherwise, what we love is really an image or a memory or an ideal. I think of another kind of a contrasting metaphor for dancing with life, and this is something that I think we do a lot of the time, and I call that wrestling with life. Wrestling with life. Maybe that's the name of a new book, Wrestling with Life. Dealing with the dukkha of our life, That I think we wrestle with life. We try to control life. We try to force it to be the way we want it to be. And when we do that, we suffer. In Buddhist teachings, there are three main ways that we wrestle with life. We wrestle with life by wanting to control it, to cling, to want things to be the way we want them to be. We want our possessions. We want to have, we want to cling to our views about being right, to our views and opinions. And when we don't get what we want, we suffer. It can be at an extreme level. It turns to addiction or obsession. And even if we do get what we want, the wanting continues, because the problem wasn't the thing we wanted, but it was really the energy of wanting. That's what we have to address, and that's what the teachings and the practices, provide us skills to address. To go to the roots of the wanting, not to look at just the symptoms, the thing that we're wanting. The second way we wrestle with life is through aversion. Resisting the way things are, wanting things to be different, wanting this person to change or this situation to change. And when they don't change, when they don't turn the way we want them to be, we suffer. And the third way we resist life, we escape from our experience, is through checking out, is through distraction or delusion. Checking out, avoiding our experience, seeing what we're experiencing as being boring, looking for something more interesting. So when we're feeling sad or anxious or worried, how easy it is to go to our devices, or to, go to a TV show or have another beer. As ways of kind of checking out, avoiding what we're feeling. And these are all ways of resisting the truth, resisting reality, resisting our experience. So the way we work with them is we turn towards them, That's the core of this practice. There's another way we wrestle with life that's very common in our modern world, and that's really through incessant doing, being caught up in constant busyness, in the sense that, with the belief that if we don't keep on doing, then everything will fall apart and terrible things will happen. And this doing is the source of much of our stress and anxiety. So with each of these unwise ways of responding, we're avoiding the present moment. We're avoiding or resisting what is. And it's painful. We feel tight, we feel contracted, we're not at ease. We're not in a flowing relationship with life. So it's really helpful just to check in with these questions. Maybe what we'll do is just take a few minutes to do a short meditation, and I'll just looking at the time and have to move very quickly into some closing remarks. But I'd like to just take a few moments to go inward, exploring this dancing with life, and just take a moment to relax and settle. Just bring kindness to what's present for you, what's alive for you right now. You might reflect just briefly on what's your deepest wish, your deepest aspiration for your life. For some, it might be of living with freedom or peace, or being fully alive or creative, or in loving relationships. Just see what comes up for you. What is your deepest wish? Imagine yourself living in that way. See if you can touch into a felt sense in the body and the heart and the mind. You might ask, how can these teachings and practices help you move more fully towards this intention, this aspiration? And now just take a moment to reflect. Is there something difficult or painful that you're dealing with right now? Maybe in your personal life or work. Could be the larger political situation or the world situation. Something that feels tight or contracted or unsatisfactory. And notice how you're feeling it in your body. Is there tightness or tension, hardness? How are you feeling it in your emotions? Is there sadness, anger, frustration, or judgment? What are you noticing? What's present in your thoughts? There are a rush of thoughts. Are they challenging? Or are they relatively at ease? Just bringing a kind attention to whatever is present for you. You might just take a deeper breath in and make space for everything. See if you can invite in an attitude of dancing with whatever you're feeling. Dancing with your life as it is, as it's expressing itself right now. Feelings, sensations, emotions, thoughts. How is it to meet them all with friendliness, with acceptance? How is it to dance with your life as it's unfolding right now? And when you're ready, you can let your eyes open, come back into awareness back into the room. And just in the last couple of minutes of the talk this evening, I want to just shift to how this practice, these practices, these teachings, these skills that we cultivate and develop by bringing awareness, by bringing an open-hearted awareness to what's present here and now, how the more we practice and the more we deepen into this kind of abandoning of what we're clinging to and cultivating, what the Buddha talked about as cultivating the good, cultivating qualities of compassion and loving kindness and joy and equanimity. The more that we do this, the more the sense of separation between ourselves and others, ourselves and the world, kind of tends to fall away. It's possible to see, and maybe some people do see these practices as really being internal practices about, how do I wake up from my suffering and how do I find some freedom in my life or some greater freedom in my life. But I think the more deeply we go into these and cultivate these skills, these teachings, these practices, the more our heart opens to the world, the more loving kindness and compassion become the natural expressions of our heart. There's an old Zen story of a student who comes to visit his dying teacher and asks them, "What is the fruit of a lifetime's teaching?" And the old teacher replies, "An appropriate response. An appropriate response." All of the teachings, we could say, hang on what is an appropriate response. What is a wise and compassionate and an appropriate response to this, whatever this is. This may be our own challenges, our own difficulties in our lives. This can also be America or the world in March 2017. What do these teachings, what do these practices call on me as a response? What response do they ask of me? There's a wonderful archetype I mentioned in Buddhist teachings of the Bodhisattva, the being who is committed, who commits themselves to the awakening of all beings. And I think that this time in our lives and in our history, perhaps more than any other time that I can recall that I've been alive, is really calling on us to be bodhisattvas, to open our hearts to the suffering of others and the suffering of the world. Whatever expression that might take, it may be for some it may be more individual expressions of caring. For others it may be more on the larger kind of social stage. I just want to mention very briefly to finish, Jack Kornfield in his book, The Wise Heart, describes 3 qualities of a bodhisattva or a spiritual warrior. She or he begins by acknowledging and accepting the truth of their situation. Not that it's right or just or moral, but it's true. And then they face the truth and they turn towards the difficulties and shine the light of understanding on them. So taking refuge in the truth. You could think of Nelson Mandela in his prison cell on Robben Island. Not saying it's right for you to put me in prison, but saying this is true. What can I do about this? What can I do that's a wise way of responding? Second, the Bodhisattva works to find peace within herself by engaging in a training or practices to let go of afflictive states, painful states such as anger, greed, and hatred, and develop positive ones like love, compassion, and peace. And third, she envisions actions and a path of liberation for herself, for her community, and for the world, and commits to working for those ends. Jack Kornfield puts it this way. He says, envisioning has enormous power. With our vision and imagination, we can help create the future. Envisioning sets our direction, marshals our resources, makes the unmanifest possible. So I think just to finish that, as in Martha Postlethwaite's poem of creating the space in our lives to sit with whatever is arising for us, whatever's alive for us, and then to have insight come from the mystery of things that then sends us out and tells us, really shows us what is a wise and compassionate response. And so as we leave here this evening, I invite you to think to spend some time reflecting, what is a wise and compassionate way of acting in the world to help alleviate the suffering that is so palpable all around us? It's been here all the time, but I've reached a level of kind of intensity, I think, that's palpable now. And our contribution really makes a difference of each one of us. So the bringing together the inner and the outer, which is, inner of our inner practices, and the outer, the engagement in the world, which is really at the core, I believe, of the Buddha's teachings and practices, and kind of invites that reflection. So thank you. I apologize for going a little bit over this evening. I hope there's something that's of help in what I've shared this evening. Namaste. Thank you.